Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I had an abrupt graduation, and when I say abrupt graduation, what I mean is I flunked college without graduating. It was 1987. I was a journalism student at the Polytechnic of Central London, but one day I got a telephone call asking me to become the keyboard player in the Frank Sidebottom Oh Blimey Big Band. So I immediately went into college and told my lecturer I was quitting, and I moved to Manchester. So I had no idea what a commencement speech entails. This is how the great American writer George Saunders describes commencement speeches. Some old fart, his best years behind him, who, over the course of his life, has made a series of dreadful mistakes, that would be me, gives heartfelt advice to a group of young, shining, energetic people with all of their best years ahead of them, that would be you. I was glad for that description because I was hoping to bore on about my life lessons. I have made dreadful mistakes, but I used to be like you, young, beautiful, and Frank Sidebottom's keyboard player. Nothing makes a young man feel more alive and on an adventure than speeding down a motorway at 2 a.m. next to a man wearing a big fake head. I was 20 and 2 years out of Cardiff, where I'd been bullied every day, stripped and blindfolded, and thrown into lakes. On reflection, it was exactly the sort of childhood a journalist ought to have. Forced to the margins, identifying with the put-upon, mistrustful of the powerful, and unwelcome by them anyway. And that's why I loved Frank Sidebottom. I loved his outsiderness, the wonderful, marginal strangeness of it all. We were on the margins together. Frank Sidebottom wasn't the only outsider artist on the Northwest's 1980s avant-garde comedy music circuit. There was Edward Barton, a quiet, bearded man who'd stand on stage and scream, "I've got no chicken, but I've got 5 wooden chairs." He kept his belongings in a tiny satchel. He travelled home with us one night, and we dropped him off in the early hours in his neighbourhood, Hume, a desolate housing estate near the city centre. We opened the van door to let him out. As he climbed down with his satchel clutched to his chest, the clasp broke and it opened, and all his possessions fell out onto the floor. We drove off, but I kept looking at him from the back window. He made no attempt to bend over and pick up his belongings. He just stood there, his head bowed, staring at the scattered debris. It seemed like I was watching a man at exactly the moment he had reached his nadir. I was confused. From where I stood, Edward Barton was living the dream. He was a fixture on the circuit. I felt a sudden flash of alarm. Was this not enough? Should I be aiming higher? And then Frank fired me for tax reasons. He stood up in court. He owed £30,000 back tax, and the judge said, "This is a very serious matter. Do you have a payment plan?" And he said, "Would £1 a week suffice, my lord?" And the judge said, "No, it would not." And so I moved back to London and I started presenting a terrible BBC Two television show nobody remembers called The Ronson Mission. One day early on, I was sitting in the corner of the editing suite watching the producer work on an interview I'd done in Bournemouth with a Conservative town councillor. For most of the interview, she'd been perfectly nice, but at times, when irritated by my questioning, she'd become screechy. In the editing suite, they were carefully stitching together her screechiest moments while leaving the nice ordinariness on the cutting room floor. I watched this black magic. "Is this bad?" I said. The producer gave me a patient look. "Think of it this way, John," he explained. "One interviewee suffers, but millions are entertained." I grinned nervously. He was right. This was okay. She was a Tory councillor. We were in the tradition of the great caricaturists like Hogarth, and history proved us to be pioneers. The approach we adopted with the town councillor became fashionable. Journalists in magazines and newspapers and on radio and TV would take the furthest reaches of their interviewees' personalities, the hysteria, the pomposity, the passive aggression, the delusions of grandeur, anything that made them abnormal, and stitch them together to ridicule them while leaving the normal stuff on the floor. We were reducing people to their flaws, to their outermost aspects. I did it to Tory grandees, white supremacists, anti-Semites, Islamic militants, and then conspiracy theorists, psychics, and eventually hippies. We didn't think hard about what we were doing. We did it because people liked it. The more we did it, the more successful we were. But I think if we had thought hard about what we were doing, we'd have realised we were creating a more conformist, conservative age. We were saying, look, we're normal. This is the average. We were defining the boundaries of normality by harshly judging the people outside of it. Most of us did it instinctively, but when I was writing my book, The Psychopath Test, I met a repentant former researcher for the kinds of daytime TV shows where families mired in drama and tragedy yell at each other. She told me she had a secret trick she utilised when booking the guests. I'd ask them what medication they were on, she told me. They'd give me a list. Then I'd go to a medical website to see what they were for. And I'd assess if they were too mad to come onto the show or just mad enough. What constituted too mad? I asked. Schizophrenia, she said. Schizophrenia was a no-no. So were psychotic episodes. If they're on lithium for psychosis, we probably wouldn't have had them on. We wouldn't want them to come on and then go off and kill themselves. Although if the story was awesome, and by awesome I mean a far-reaching mega-family argument that's going to make a really charged show,